can, yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. The title is a little bit provocative, perhaps. So I do think actually that we will never discover whether LLMs have intuitions. Um, I think especially, I don't think that we will ever simply discover that LLMs have intuitions. I think the negative cases maybe sometimes can be more obvious, but let me explain why I think that. So I'm very happy to be at this conference because I think that this question is very relevant. For example, yesterday, Britt Curry explained why we cannot empathize with AI, ChatGPT or AI technologies that are lacking certain epistemic states. And intuitions are one of those kinds of states. So we might say, for example, I have the intuition that X. That means that I have some sort of feeling of credence in X. In principle, I could maybe still intellectually not believe that X is actually true, but I have some intuition that that is the case. And then I think Gina asked the question, well, how do we know that LLMs don't have intuitions and emotions and beliefs, which is very interesting. And Lorenzo, if I remember correctly, asked an LLM also whether it has intuitions. So we are interested in this question, and already we have one of two possible broad avenues for investigating this. So we can either look at the output of the system, for example, if we ask it whether it has intuitions, or we could also look at just its reasoning. If we ask it to explain its reasoning, we might say, well, seems like intuitive reasoning rather than, for example, deductive reasoning. And then very often we would say, well, this is not enough. Of course, ChatGPT can tell us whatever it wants, but if we want to know what's really going on, we have to look inside the model. So we have to understand the architecture a little bit. So broadly, we can either say we care about the output, we care about what's going on inside the model, maybe we care about both of those. And I think that in either case, there is really no method now or in the future. So that doesn't really matter whether we're talking about ChatGPT in the way it exists now or large language models in the future. I think that there are kind of conceptual problems that make it so that we can discover all kinds of things, and we need to discover these things in order to understand LLMs better. But by themselves, none of these discoveries can actually determine whether a concept that we already have, and the concepts I'm interested in are what we might call mental kinds, like intuitions. Whether or not these terms apply properly to something we discover inside an LLM or in its output isn't determined by the discovery, because there's always an element of social choice. And the two arguments I have for this are very different in some respects, but they are similar in that they're both about social choice. So first, looking at philosophical debates about natural kind terms and discoveries, I conclude that extensions of kind terms are determined by social choice, which is informed by scientific discovery, but it's not determined by scientific discovery. So this is a general point about how science interacts with the extensions of kind terms. And the other point is requires kind of a more specific view of how intuitions and other mental states that have particular epistemic roles work. So the idea is that you might think that in order to count as an intuition, I have to be able to invoke this intuition as a reason that I give when someone asks me to justify some claim I am making, some epistemic claim. And in that case, the community of rational subjects or epistemic subjects, which are the community is necessary in order to provide kind of the infrastructure for this kind of activity of giving and asking for reasons. And in that sense, whether or not an LLM can have an intuition depends on whether we recognize it as the kind of entity that can do that. And that is a social question that also isn't determined by anything that we can discover in the LLMs themselves or their output. The negative cases might be less related to my arguments, because we can just all agree in some cases that my calculator does not have intuitions or something like that. But so I'm mostly interested in positive discoveries and whether or not they can determine how we use the terms. So what I'm going to call this the standard view, just because that's what you get taught if you take a class in philosophy of language, is you learn about true and error, and you learn about widget designators, and then you come up with this idea that what happens is that we discover something, we have these words like water and charcoal and so on. And then in history, people used to learn how to use the words by touching or smelling or looking at the substances. And There are different details to this account that don't really matter to us that much, but at some point we discover the microstructures of the substances. So we discover that water is H2O, for example, and then we have discovered that water is necessarily H2O. So the way that we typically encounter the story is as a natural kind essentialism. I don't think that I need to talk about essentialism for my argument to work, and also not really about whether the kinds are natural. So I'm just going to talk about kinds. But if this story was true, if the situation was like, well, we have a word, let's say intuitions, and then we can make a scientific discovery about maybe in cognitive neuroscience that reveals to us what intuitions actually are, then afterwards we could make a second discovery about LLMs, which would give us a positive or negative outcome that tells us whether the concept applies to them or not. That would be nice, but I don't think that we can transfer this story to LLMs, and the reason is that it's already wrong when we talk about normal, quote unquote, substances, when we talk about things like H2O. And the case is arguably a lot more difficult for LLMs and mental kinds than it is for example, minerals. So here's the story about why this doesn't discovering the extensions of natural kind terms isn't what actually happens when humans live in the world. I'm not going to read out the whole Kripke version, but he invites us to imagine that we might discover a substance that has a different atomic structure from water, but has all the same kind of mesoscale properties in our daily life. And he says, I don't think we would call it water. So he has himself an intuition about this. But the reason why he has this intuition is that he thinks that the extension of the word water was fixed when we discovered its microstructure. And Putnam has a stronger version of that, which is the famous scientific science fictional. Sorry, it's not science. I don't specifically don't want to call it scientific. And this is kind of a aside or more general thing. I think it's very useful to study the history and philosophy of science because so much of analytic philosophy in different areas, even in philosophy of science itself, is downstream of stuff in philosophy of language that I think we don't have super good reasons to believe in, and often relies on our own intuitions. For example, in this case, Putnam has the strong intuition that if we discovered twin Earth, where everything is the same except what looks like water has a different microstructure, we abbreviate the microstructure as XYZ. And then he says in the story, well, I left out a tiny part where at first they think it's water, but then they discover that it's actually not water. So they report back to Earth, oh, on twin Earth, the word water means something different. It means this other stuff. It means XYZ. And he specifically says that there's no problem about the extension of the term. It just has two different meanings. So what he's saying is that we wouldn't, in fact, call XYZ water, and also there wouldn't be any debate about this. So this wouldn't require some social choice and negotiation, but we just wouldn't call it water. That is probably not true, and Laporte has what I think we can fairly call a takedown of this in 2004, where he says if we were to find XYZ, we would have found a substance that is a borderline member of the extension of water. We might call it water, or maybe not. It could go either way. Now, this is just a claim. It's a thought experiment, but luckily we have an actual case about ruby and topaz in the history of modern crystallography. So ruby originally meant red, and the stones that we called rubies were only red stones. Later, we found out that the basic mineral structure also sometimes appears in blue. So in these kinds of minerals, you have a crystal lattice type structure, and then you have very small impurities of maybe titanium or aluminum, which are just a few atoms scattered throughout this lattice, and they change the color. So you have the same basic microstructure, but it might be blue or red. And speakers decided that only the red stones are called ruby. The blue stuff is called something else. I think sapphires. They said, well, this is just a variety of the mineral that we call ruby. They didn't ignore the science, but they simply made the social choice. And also Laporte points out nicely, for me, he uses the word discovered, it's his italics, to say that we didn't discover that ruby is a variety of the mineral that composes it. We made this choice whether ruby can actually be blue. It wasn't clear when we made the discovery. It only became a fact of language when we made the choice. And the fact that it could have gone otherwise is indicated by the contrasting case of topaz, which apparently means fire. But topaz or yellow stones, and then we discovered that there are other minerals that have the same microstructural composition, and they appear in other colors like light blue or light green. And now we discovered, so to speak, well, we decided that topaz also applies to these other stones. So now we say that there is blue topaz. We could have said that there's blue ruby, but we don't. And these are social choices that were historically contingent. They were not determined by the scientific discoveries. So what does this all mean for large language models? Right, so in this case, we see that the extensions of kind terms are determined by social choices, which are responsive to, but not determined by scientific discoveries. And I think everything that's true for stones is probably way worse for LLMs and intuition. So think about this. Ruby and topaz have very palpable reference, right? These are mineral stones we can touch. And intuitions are kind of elusive, so it's hard to pin down what exactly we mean by intuitions, and this is true for most of our mental kind terms. And also, the way that so in terms of the structure of discoveries, in the case of water and XYZ, you have two separate scientific discoveries. In the case of ruby and topaz, you have two separate scientific discoveries, but the science is the same. You're using the same methods and the same theories to investigate very similar substances, and the kind of microstructures all follow the same kind of rules. We apply the same epistemic practices. But if you're asking whether an LLM has intuitions, these are two, like on the one side, you have a human or a brain, depending on how you're studying us. And on the other side, you have an LLM, where, of course, these all are broadly, there's a big tent cognitive science area of inquiry, but there are many different methods, and the phenomena are immediately very dissimilar, right? An LLM is not a person made from flesh and blood, and so on. So the gap that we have to bridge between the two phenomena, if we want to say that the same concept applies both to humans and to LLMs, seems initially bigger than the gap between two different stones, if we want to find out whether both are ruby or not. And specifically for mental kind terms, the terms that we use are very old, and people have pointed this out in cognitive neuroscience, especially when criticizing this project of trying to localize different functions or faculties in the brain at different points, that we are trying to find specific kinds of memory or specific capacities for action and reflection. And we use the same terminology that we had at the end of the 19th century, basically. And in other sciences, we have completely overhauled our conceptual vocabularies. We have discarded lots of central terms because they don't match our best science anymore. And in psychology, we still have all these old words. And maybe the words aren't the right ones. So this would be kind of a separate problem for in trying to find out whether we have the same kinds of mental properties as LLMs, but just assuming that we do have intuitions and that those are the right kinds of words, I think we have good reason to believe that if the discoveries about the microstructure of minerals don't even determine how we apply those words, it seems even less likely that for LLMs, discoveries about the LLMs could determine whether we call them intuitions or not. And of course, we don't know what future discoveries will look like, but we can imagine some, I dream up some cases, right? So imagine that a neural network or system that's like some system of neurons in our brain is associated with intuitive thinking. And then we show somehow that it is isomorphic in a certain sense to a number of connected nodes inside of a LLM in the future. That could be one kind of discovery. Or we could think that we have a model in computational neuroscience of intuitive thinking, and we then show that it computes the same function that also is computed in some part of an LLM that is important for generating the kinds of output that for us look like intuitive thinking. So you might have a certain kind of output where the reasoning seems like intuitive reasoning, and then you can try to find out which of the nodes in the network are most responsible for this particular output. I don't actually know how people do that, but I imagine that it must be very similar to the basic way that you train the networks, because when you train using back propagation, you look at the error between the output you got and what you actually wanted, and then you propagate this error backwards and also have like a mathematical way of determining which of the nodes are more or less responsible for producing the error, and then you adjust the weights between the nodes. So I imagine that a similar method can help us identify which part of the LLM is responsible for intuitive thinking. Or you could think, for example, that you have something like an fMRI study where you get data about what goes on in someone's brain when they do intuitive reasoning in the scanner. And then you could use the activation of a large language model to try to predict the variation in the data. And this is very similar actually to what people already do with image processing, machine learning systems, and the visual stream in the brain. So there are people who think that certain kinds of um, image categorization machine learning systems are actual mechanical models of the brain because they are so good at predicting the data that we measure in the brain. And then there are other people who think that we don't have good reason to believe that. But I think that in each of these scenarios, so even if we have a complete freedom to dream up our ideal scientific outcome, um, I don't think any of these would determine whether we would say that LLMs really have intuitions. And one thing to keep in mind as well is that this is again the difference in scenario between having two stones and having on the one side a large language model. It has the word model in the name, right? And human brain, where there's always the option of interpreting the language model as a model of the human brain. Um, and in most other scientific scenarios, we wouldn't say that a model of something, even if it's a very good model, that it instantiates all of the properties of the phenomenon that it's modeling, right? So if you have the Navier-Stokes equation of fluid dynamics, you don't think that there's anything wet about the equations, right? Even if it's maybe perfect at modeling the liquid that is wet. But in the case of LLMs and general like computational models of the mind, we often have this conflation where we say if the model exhibits certain kinds of features that we have, that we also see in human minds, we are tempted to say that the model maybe is the mind. And you can justify this maybe if you have like a certain metaphysical beliefs about mind, like functionalism. But again, the metaphysical commitments are also choices. They don't fall out of empirical discoveries. So I just don't think that we have the empirical grounds to um, discover the extensions of these kind terms. Sorry, that's actually what I just said. Um, And now you might say, well, all of this seems to focus on what's going on inside the models. But what about if we care more about the output of the models? Maybe we're some special kind of a philosophical behaviorist or a pragmatist. Um, in the case of humans, some people want to deny that it actually matters at all what's going on inside my own mind, and it only matters whether other people recognize me as, for example, when I say I have a pain in my foot, as far as I understand, Rory claims that whether or not I can make that claim and have justification for making that claim doesn't actually depend on whether my foot hurts. It depends on whether other people let me get away with it. So let's look at this social aspect of um, the epistemic function or epistemic role that mental kinds like intuitions play. And I had a very like a rough, not really pre-theoretic, but not super deeply informed version of this view as an idea. So the idea would be that intuitions are what they are, partly because of maybe what happens in our brain or inside of a large language model, but also partly in virtue of how they function within the social processes, these epistemic processes of justification that require the owner of the intuition to be recognized by others as the kind of entity that can give and ask for reasons. So if we imagine this, we would say, well, it's possible that an LLM can produce a certain output that looks like intuitive reasoning, but whether or not that actually counts as intuitive reasoning depends on whether a community of uh, rational, cognizing epistemic subjects recognizes the LLM as a participant with full membership rights in this community, right, as the kind of entity that can actually assert things rather than just producing text and so on. If that is, if we buy into this account of how mental kinds function, and we think that these functions are an essential part of what these mental kinds are, then again, it's not just a discovery about the models themselves that could determine whether the terms apply, but there's a social choice. Maybe we could individually decide or collectively whether or not we treat these LLMs as those kinds of entities. And you might think at first that saying having this very specific account of what a mental kind is and having these strict requirements for a specific social context sounds like it would limit the applicability of the argument. But I think actually, if you think about the alternatives, it's not so bad because you might say, well, sure, there is a social aspect in my life to how I use my intuitions, but there also seems to be a private way to have intuitions, right? So like there's subjective experience. I can have intuitions. I can use them to justify my beliefs, maybe just silently to myself. And I think that that's a good argument. I actually do make an argument like that for myself for subjective experience against someone like Roddy. But in the case of LLMs, it's different, right? Because we are not the LLM, we are on the outside. So for us, it doesn't really matter whether the LLM has some more meaningful private access to its intuitions, even if we imagine that it had subjective experience, some more advanced future LLM that wouldn't really put us in a position to discover anything about it because we don't have access to that subjective experience, right? So everything that we say requires that we are going to treat the LLM in a certain way as a matter of our position on the outside as observers. And I'm using recognition without any sophisticated technical vocabulary. Of course, that exists. So there's Brandam's reading of Hegel, for example, in The Structure of Desire and Recognition. And I don't think we need to take on board this sophisticated Hegelian apparatus. I think could be very rewarding to do that. I mean, but I can't do that by myself because I'm not a Hegel scholar. Some of it, although like my non-professional familiarity with this informed the basic idea. So Brandam's Hegel um, claims that to recognize someone is to take her to be the subject of normative statuses, which, among other things, entails being capable of undertaking responsibilities and exercising authority. And for us, interestingly, in the case of LLMs, it was mean that you are not merely producing outputs, but you can make claims appropriate. So if you produce output that makes claims about the world, they only count as claims if you are the kind of entity that is recognized as being able to make claims. Now, for humans in this account, recognition has to be reciprocal and also involves self-recognition and then turns into self-consciousness and so on. We don't really need, I think, that strong a view. One thing I wanted to point out, though, is that in Hegel, all of this builds on a less demanding stage or description, which is desire. And you might think that on a properly Hegelian account of recognition, maybe LLMs don't qualify because they don't have this precursor stage. They don't actually have desire because they don't have biological needs and embodiment and all that good stuff. So you might rule out LLMs on that view. But I think if we don't have this, we don't aspire to be proper Hegelians or Brandomians or something like that, and instead we just have something like a more vague or minimal notion of what it would take to be recognized as someone who can justify epistemic claims and make them, you still get this basic problem where if part of what it takes for an LLM to have intuitions is to be recognized by us as such a subject, then no discovery about the LLM, either inside of the LLM or about its output, can by itself determine whether it has intuitions or not. Interestingly, now you might say, well, if it depends on how we treat the LLMs, that just seems like an empirical question for the social sciences or for psychology. And I actually do think that it's very interesting. So I would be interested. I'm trying to start, hopefully, collaborations. I talked to moral psychologists here at Penn State. They are very interested in interdisciplinary research and have a consortium on this where we submitted a seed grant. So we'll see what happens. But I'm interested in whether, for example, people are more or less likely to recognize LLMs as having mental properties, and we could operationalize this in a perhaps less in a thinner way by saying, well, would they use the kinds of words that we think ascribe these kinds of mental and epistemic states and capacities? Are they more or less likely to do that if they have more or less knowledge about what LLMs actually are and how they work? I think this would be interesting because if we, for example, see that the more people know about how LLMs work, the less likely they are to treat them as cognizers or subjects capable of having intuitions. There would be maybe a reason for us to say that we don't want to say they have intuitions. And even if there is such an effect, I'm interested in whether there's a difference between having like a purely technical understanding of the architecture of a transformer, for example, or of having more knowledge about what happens when you use LLMs. So, for example, I'm thinking about when you see on the news that LLMs are so useful for coding computer programs, you get a different story from the headlines and the articles in big magazines than you get if you watch professional Twitch streamer software developers, which apparently is a thing. So there are people who earn a living by talking about software development and coding on Twitch, and they have very different views about how useful LLMs are for coding. So there are different kinds of knowledge we could have about them, and they might influence how we treat LLMs. I'm interested in that. But I still think that at the end of the day, even if we discover that there are certain contexts and certain groups of people who treat LLMs as the kinds of entities capable of having intuitions, and then we could say, well, we have the social part, and then maybe we also have some discovery about what happens inside the models that we say matches what we would like to see if they have intuitions. I still think in all of those scenarios, we still, even though we choose to treat them as capable of having intuitions, we could also, in principle, stop doing so. And I think we might actually have reasons to do that. And the reasons might not be anything that we found out about the inside of the models or their output. But if you think that it's very important for being a human being that you have rational thought, and I mean, this is not a bizarre view. This famous philosophers have argued that humans are rational being in an essential way. Then the way in which we determine who we recognize as other rational subjects is also an important aspect of how we relate to ourselves, how we think about ourselves and this human community. So very quickly and carelessly broadening the scope of who we recognize as subjects, epistemic subjects, might actually have unforeseen negative consequences. And I mean, most of what we're doing with AI has unforeseen negative consequences so far, empirically speaking. So I think we have good reasons to think carefully about this question. Um, and in conclusion, I think that we don't have I don't think that we can have reasons for recognizing LLMs as having intuitions or other mental properties, but I don't think that they could ever be purely epistemic in the sense that I don't think we can make discoveries about matters of fact that can determine by themselves whether or not some of these concepts apply because the epistemic grounds themselves always leave a gap that we have to fill with a decision. And also because these kinds of decisions are always have they're normative in the sense that they like impart a different kind of status on the entities that we make the judgment about, but they also might have effects on the normative relationships that we have to ourselves and towards each other. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you a lot for your very well documented presentation. See if you have any questions in person. Okay, please.
Hi team, thank you for your presentation. Honestly, I have several questions, but first was the shortest, honestly, is the mainest. Yeah. Yeah, we were talking right now that AI hasn't like intuition, but how do you think about mental states? I mean, usually one of criterion intuition or criteria that connected with intuition is the feeling of mental states or understanding that the mental state just exists, for example. And we can find some researchers that says that AI passed the test to understand the mental states. So first of all, just your position about the mental states of AI.
Yeah, so I think there are several distinctions we can make and that you already brought up. One of them is this question of there's a lot of mental states we think involve having subjective experience, but then they are, I think, and there are people who have different views on this in cognitive science, but I think that subjective experience is in principle private. I don't think that we can ever have access to someone else's subjective experience. And then, of course, this is a undesirable outcome for many people philosophically, and there are different versions that people argue against this. One of them is to try to either deny that subjective experience exists, or they try to package this in a nicer way by just using the word experience differently so that we can't really talk about the problem anymore, and then you get a functional account of experience. I'm not sure what that means, but or you say that it's an illusion. um, I think that experience is extremely important for the kinds of minds that we are. And I think it's philosophically important because it's the hardest thing to explain. I think if you bracket subjective experience, it becomes way more plausible to talk about mental states and processes in through like external science and mechanistic explanation. And we have seen historically these big shifts, right? So for Descartes, the ability to produce language seemed to be a very safe bet for saying this is a marker of the mental, right? He thought that a machine could never produce language because you need to reason in order to do that. And now, to be fair to our opponents, it seems that the people like me, who are sometimes called Mysterians, are on the defensive because now we have to give up on language and all of that stuff, right? And they are more and more, the more advanced our technology gets, the more of these mental capacities that we used to think are only for humans and we make us special, we have to give up on them. So I think we can basically put subjective experience to the side because we can't
Yeah,
investigate scientifically in the
sorry.
problem.
When you talk about subjective experience, you mean like you also mentioned Hilary Putnam's before and his theory, and we know that in his latest work he wrote about this qualia reality rejection that we the mental states used to have, for example, physical body to feel this qualia. Without it, we cannot feel the subject reality, or for example the brain in the bottle theory and all of this. But I mean, like, don't you think that in the if the mental states, if AI understand the mental states,
Mhm.
all his reply will be just the Frankfurt cases or something like Frankfurt cases, because you also talked in presentation about like theory of alternative decision in philosophy of in theory of philosophy of conscience. But I mean, looks like because of this, you know, the algorithmic determinism, every reply of AI is just the case of Frankfurt.
So I think you're right in that there are many kinds of mental features where the most popular philosophical theories that we have of them, if we applied them to LLMs, would suggest that LLMs have those mental features or capacities. And I think that is because a lot of our way of doing philosophy of mind focuses on language. So if we think that, for example, whether or not someone has a belief is depends on like the way to test that is to ask them questions and then see what they say. If that's your basic methodology for investigating what a belief is, then LLMs will be in a good position to, at least in principle, be able to meet any criteria that you come up with for generating a test. But I think one thing that could happen is that we say, okay, we have different theories in philosophy of mind, but we develop them, and this is maybe less true for some than for others, but I think in general, when we developed these kinds of philosophy of mind in the 20th century, we were mostly thinking about human cognizers. And the theories seem more inherently plausible because I think that we bake into them some implicit assumptions about where not just that the entity that we are asking, for example, if they believe something or not, or if they have beliefs and so on. We don't just want them to give the correct output, but we also think that the output has to have been generated in the right way.
Okay.
And I think that typically for humans, if we want to give a theory and philosophy of mind of what a belief is, that's not we have less severe problem of specifying what it means to be produced in the right way. So, for example, we don't want the person to be sleepwalking or speaking in tongues or hallucinating or so when they answer a question about beliefs, because then we wouldn't think that what they're saying actually accurately reflects the mental states that we're interested in. But there are other things that we wouldn't have to make explicit in the mental theory. So, for example, if I have a bowl of alphabeti spaghetti, so noodles that are shaped like letters, and I stir it with my spoon, it's possible in theory that randomly the letters form words, right? So it's possible for a bowl of alphabeti spaghetti, at least like logically possible, to display any verbal behavior that we could imagine. But of course, there's no possible, it doesn't matter how unlikely the sequence of constellations of noodles is, we would never say that the bowl of alphabeti spaghetti has mental states. So it's not just the output. And LLMs are somewhere on a scale between humans and alphabeti spaghetti, but I'm not sure that at least some theories in philosophy of mind that we have were generated with a scope where we didn't have to specifically try to rule out certain scenarios. So no one has to rule out the alphabeti spaghetti because that's ridiculous. But the further you move away from humans, you get you're changing the scope of what the theory applies to. So you get new questions of whether something has to come up as a serious question. So I think that if we make discoveries about LLMs, where we say, based on the theory of understanding that we developed for what it means for a human to understand something, the LLMs pass that test, I think it still generates a question of whether we think that this proper scope of the theory includes these other objects of investigation.
Yeah,
I'm probably
thank
not
you.
saying.
Yeah, you answered clear about, but I have one more question right now after it. According to the first part of your speech, just remind, you talked about the language method of testing. I mean, how, according to the philosophy of mind, philosophy of conscience, how we can test AI system to make more clear understanding of different terms of different processes, um, except then the language methods. Do you have any ideas, or do you have some practice in it?
Well, I mean, very generally, I think one thing that's interesting is to think about the comparison between how we study AI and how we study animals. So for animals, we have many of the same problems, whereas there's a paper from 2018 in Nature that says honeybees understand the concept of zero. Very bizarre. And I don't think they don't actually make that claim. The claim is I think that's the title of not the scientific paper, but it's the article online that reports on that. But the way that we talk about the claims is very difficult, and it's difficult because we have broadly two ways of figuring out whether honeybees can do something, whether they have some mental capacity. One of them is that we try to design a task, and then if they can solve the task, we say they must have this capacity because we designed the task in such a way that you can only solve it if you have that capacity. And that, I think, matches what we would think of as like a verbal test of a mental capacity in philosophy of mind. And then the other way to do it is to say that you look how the behavior is produced. So you look inside the honeybee, you try to study its neural organization and so on. And then also the way that it acts in its environment. But you might have something like a mechanistic explanation of how the task performance is actually achieved. And then if that explanation uses the right kinds of explanantia, the right kinds of parts to explain how the behavior is produced, you might say that that's a good way to distinguish having the capacity from not having it. So for LLMs, it would mean that, yes, on the one hand, we can see what kinds of output it can produce. And on the other hand, we can try to understand more about what's going on inside the architecture and how it produces the output.
So does it mean that we still need some kind of, I don't know, physicalistic reductionism to understand like AI in its heart?
I think that there's a generally in this broad area of philosophy of mind and cognitive science, I think that there's a bad conflation between metaphysical commitments and methodological orientations. And like the classical example for this is behaviorism, which was a methodology in experimental psychology, and then philosophers turned it into a metaphysical commitment that has a very counterintuitive aspects, let's put it like that. And I think that those can come apart. So I do think that in order to understand large language models better, we have to use our best science and maybe also develop some new methods for studying what actually happens inside the models, and also for studying how the models work once they get deployed by humans and once humans interact with them in different contexts. I think it's easy to underestimate that because the models sound so complex, or they have 70 billion parameters and whatever. So it feels like the mystery is inside the model, but actually a lot of the things that we care about cannot be deduced from just an understanding of the architecture, but they only occur, those are the important phenomena only occur once models get deployed in these existing human social ecosystems. So we have to study all of that. And some of the ways we study them will probably look reductionist, but I'm not sure that that means that we have to have any specific metaphysical commitments about that.
Yeah. Thank you for your answer. Thank you.
This being said, thank you very much for your presentation and for joining our conference today.
Thank you
I
for
can stop our recording. Okay.